Yeah, as Paul said, the topic of today is the inaccessibility of fun. And it is, I think, a little bit more optimistic than the title may suggest, but it's basically the acknowledgement of what I think is the single most difficult problem if you are a game designer looking to make accessible games. So just before we begin, some of the reciprocal thanks here. I'd like to thank everybody for all the organization that went into this under what is, I think, unexpectedly challenging circumstances. And I think over the past few years, our threshold for what an unexpected challenge actually is has changed considerably. But it's nice to see that, one of the benefits of us being so flexible and being able to move online through COVID is that these kind of events can still go on, even when circumstances outside our control conspire to make that difficult to do. So this particular talk is going to focus on this idea of inaccessibility rather than accessibility as a more positive thing, as a lens that we can use to understand the difficulties that go into designing and constructing particularly analog gaming experiences. And the theme of today, or at least one of the themes of today, is corporeality. And I think it's hard to imagine a topic that is more applicable to that particular theme than what it means like to physically or emotionally experience the process of play. And accessibility is something that is exceptionally important in that kind of area. So before we launch into the actual topic itself, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about myself. I tend to consider myself the least interesting person in any room. So I tend to just skip over these things as quickly as possible. And I know Paul has already spoken a fair bit about this, but mostly my main area of research and what has gone from being a research interest to a research obsession is the topic of board game accessibility. Now, 10 years ago or 11 years ago, when I started looking at accessibility in games, it was mostly about video games. And at the time, there wasn't a huge amount of progress happening in video game accessibility. 5 years later, the circumstances changed entirely, to the point that now, if you make an inaccessible video game, you will see yourself covered in all kinds of newspapers and articles and periodicals, not in the way that you would hope. Recently, the game Spyro the Dragon came out without subtitles. And the response when people raised this on social media and Reddit and such was, nobody really knows how to do subtitles for games. Cue a solid week of exceptionally critical opinion pieces and editorials and such. And surprise, surprise, Spyro the Dragon now has subtitles. We are not anywhere near that kind of having the availability of that kind of what you might think of as a kind of pester power to make large board game publishers make their games accessible in the same kind of way. But there is a lot of progress being made. But when I started 6 years ago, there was almost nothing. There was a site called 64 Ounce Games, I think games, maybe it's just 64 Ounce, who were making Braille conversion kits for board games. But aside from that, it was a topic I never saw being discussed at all. So as I started to get more into board games, I felt this need to justify it to myself and saying, this is really something I'm doing for work. All these board games behind me are research material. They're not toys, as the movers mark them, and I've been upset about that for 2 years. And I thought, well, I'll spend a little time thinking about this topic. I'll maybe write a paper about it, and then I'll just move on to something else. And then 6 years later, this is still the single most interesting problem domain for accessibility that I've ever encountered. So let's begin the actual proper part of this with a definition. And this is a definition that is not necessarily the definition that you'll find in medical textbooks about disability. But this is the one that we're going to use today. And we're going to say that inaccessibility is any barrier, real or imagined, that stands between someone and a goal that they set for themselves. So in this, we are looking at accessibility from what's often considered to be the social model of looking at how people interact with society. So a brief little bit of history here. Early on, when people talked about disability, they used what was called the medical model. And the medical model is, you can kind of sum it up as stand there while we fix you. And the idea is that you're trying to make sure that somebody has minimum functionality to be able to participate in society. And beyond that, sorry, but that's as much as we're hoping is going to be the case. The medical model tends to look at people as being outliers as far as how society should be designed. And it's not the responsibility of the rest of us to change what we do in line with what outliers, the difficulties outliers have in dealing with society. And that was obviously, we can see now, a very dehumanizing view of what it means to have a disability. So over the years, what we progressed to is what's called the social model of disability. And that's the idea that inaccessibility, certainly in terms of what we construct as a society, it doesn't happen organically. You know, when there's a set of stairs rather than a ramp, stairs don't exist naturally in the real world. Somebody decided to put stairs there. And so the social model stresses a kind of communal responsibility for dealing with issues of disability and issues of accessibility. And this conception here of inaccessibility as being any barrier is very much in line with how the social model of disability tends to view things. We are looking to find a way together where we can make things more accessible. And anytime there is something that stops somebody doing what they would like to do, we need to consider, how do we work to remove those barriers? And in most circumstances, that's not that difficult. You know, if there is a set of stairs in the front of somebody, then the decision to put a ramp in or to make a lift available someplace else, that's not a controversial or difficult decision. The problem that we have when we're talking about games is something a little bit deeper, and it's something that I think is unique to this particular discipline. But again, we will come to that. Within the work of People Like Us, one of the things I have done is taken a very broad view of what accessibility is. And in that, we cover all the stuff you would expect to be there. You know, color blindness, visual accessibility from people who have, you know, minor visual impairments to people who have conditions of total blindness. We talk about cognitive impairments. We talk about fine-grained and gross motor control and all those different kinds of things. And those are relatively uncontroversial. But one of the other things that we talk about, or one of the other categories of things we talk about, is what I sometimes refer to as sociological accessibility, which are things like, how do our games impact on groups of people, and how do they impact on the personal emotional experience of people? I mean, we all know, I'm sure, somebody who we don't want to play games with because they're a bad loser, or even worse, a bad winner. We, I'm sure, are aware that as Kickstarter becomes one of the backbones of the funding for particularly the analog gaming area, that these games are becoming progressively more unaffordable. And that if you're looking to pay $500 for the full fat version of a board game, that's pricing the hobby outside of what a lot of people can afford, particularly when the frame of reference most people have is the cost of a game of Monopoly. But one of the more controversial things that we often talk about on the site are issues of representation and issues of inclusion, because it's not just a case, when we look at this definition of inaccessibility, it's not just the case of, can you play it, but also, do you feel as if this is a game for you? If you go into a board game shop and you see shelves and shelves of covers containing middle-aged white guys looking serious, what you tend to think is, this is a hobby for serious middle-aged white guys. And when we have more diverse representation across how board games look, more people can see themselves as being able to participate in the hobby because they feel as if the hobby is welcoming. And I consider that lack of representation to be an inaccessibility. If somebody can't see themselves being represented in the game, then there is a barrier to including them in this particular hobby. But let's talk about some of the games that we've looked at on the site and the reasons for this idea of inaccessibility of fun. So one of the games I like to talk about the most is a game called Galaxy Trucker. And Galaxy Trucker is a real-time game where what you're doing is you're trying to construct, at the same time as all your friends, a spaceship that's going to be able to survive a journey, a trade journey from one place to another. It's by a company called Czech Games, and it's by a designer, and apologies if I butcher this name, but Vlada Chvátil, who has this sort of post-Soviet Union view of the future, which is the future is going to be rubbish. And so when you build these spaceships, what you build are horrible compromises that have, lasers pointing the wrong way and engines that are, directly firing onto other parts of the ship. You have shields that only point in one direction, and then you have crew quarters that are too close so that people are going to die from pandemics, which is, kind of raw in this day and age, but at the time wasn't quite such a controversial choice. And it's a game where the whole design is set up for you to fail. It's not supposed to be a game that you succeed at. So it's fast, it's real time, and pretty much what's going to happen to your spaceship is you're going to be lucky if it comes through the other end intact. Because whenever you lose a part of the ship, like if you lose a connecting beam, you have to pick which half of the ship you're keeping. And so if you are the kind of person who has to be able to succeed in order to enjoy a game, and that's true of a lot of people, winning makes a game more fun for a lot of people. Thankfully not me, because I very rarely win any games, but it does make games a lot more fun for people. And if you can't put yourself into that emotional mindset that you are supposed to enjoy failure, Galaxy Trucker is a game that you're just never going to be able to get with. But on the more traditional levels, because it's fast, because the timing is set by the other people around the table, and because you are physically engaging with a series of tiles that are sprawled around the board, it has this aspect of physical inaccessibility, but that goes along with this emotional inaccessibility of you have to enjoy failure. I think I saw on the participants list that the designer of Fog of Love is here. So I just wanted to say in advance, I love Fog of Love. I think it's an excellent, innovative, really interesting game. But it also has this almost unique aspect of inaccessibility, which is, if you've never played Fog of Love, it's basically a kind of conversational game where you play the part of a couple with competing goals who are going through various scenarios, and you have to decide how you're going to respond to those different kinds of scenarios. And what I found with Fog of Love, and what's been reiterated to me over the years, is that you need to be a very particular combination of people to play that. You may have, for example, conversations about, should we have a child? Or, what's your view on these particular issues? And what that tends to then do is bring up this amorphous blurring of the boundaries between real life and play. What we sometimes refer to in academia as the magic circle. The magic circle does not hold in Fog of Love, because you have this conversation in the game about, well, should we have a child? And then that becomes, if you're part of a couple playing the game, well, should we really? And then this becomes what I like to refer to as awkward conversations, the board game, because nobody was expecting this conversation when they sat down to play the game. But as I say, Fog of Love is a fantastic, really, really interesting game. But this is one of the inaccessibilities in the design that come from it, in that if you don't feel comfortable with the topics, you're not going to find that to be a particularly enjoyable game. And the next time somebody says, shall we play Fog of Love? You might think, rather play Monopoly. So The Resistance is a game of social deduction, which means that some of you are good people and other people are bad people trying to undermine the good people. And nobody knows except for the villains who other people are. And the idea is that you get to do a series of missions. The good people hope the missions will succeed. The bad people will work to make the missions fail. And you have to work out, as part of the structure of the game, who's on which teams and who's going to be sent on which missions. So that's a game that is often notable for just how tense and uncomfortable the conversation becomes, and how much the conversation becomes a case of, you said this, but that's a lie. That person said this, that's the truth. And then you're basically trying to talk over other people to make sure they never get to lay out the logical case as to why they're the good people. And that's difficult from a communication perspective. For example, if you have, if you are signing in a conversation and everybody else is loudly arguing, it's very easy for you to be overlooked because the sophistication of the arguments you have to make is quite significant. Terror in Meeple City, another cool example of an unusual game here. It's a game that is about flicking, and it's about flicking monsters at built up areas. I don't think it's in print anymore, which is a shame, but it's about flicking these monsters. It's about being able to move around a table, which is something that people often don't consider as being a board game accessibility issue. You know, if somebody's in a wheelchair, for example, well, if they're seated in front of the game, seated, if they're seated in front of the game, then that's fine. You know, they can play the game. But if you think of things like pool or crokinole or Terror in Meeple City, one of the ways that you have to play the game is finding the angle where you should be in order to make a particularly precise shot on the board. But Terror in Meeple City is also the only game I can easily think of where your ability to breathe is actually an accessibility issue. Because one of the things that you can do is you can breathe fire or, you know, ice or whatever from one of the creatures. And one of the way you do that is you put your chin on top of the monster, take a deep breath, and blow as hard as you can. And what you're trying to do is blow little meeples and cars and such across the board. And that's the only game where I can think of where that's the case. And it's really, really fun. But if you're on, for example, a respirator, that is a game that is completely impossible for you to play. Don't worry, it's not this. The lectures isn't just the lecture. You can see what my normal mindset is. The talk isn't just games, examples of games. We will get into more meaty stuff as we go on. Codenames, incredibly popular, but it is a game about vocabulary, and also more importantly, it's a game about inference and being able to make connections between words. So you'll have a grid of words. You know, snowman, frying pan, car. And what you're supposed to do is link those words together with a clue. And then your teammates are supposed to guess which words you've actually referred to without hitting the words that they're not supposed to reference. And the problem with Codenames is it's a very, very simple game, but it's very strongly linked to your ability to linguistically reason. And because I teach in Sweden, all the instruction in Sweden at the master's level is in English, which is handy because my Swedish is not something anybody wants to hear me teaching in. But we're talking about people who come from a wide range of nationalities where English is a second language for almost everyone. So if you're playing a game like this, despite the fact that their English is excellent, I often say, you know, the standard of English in Sweden is higher than the standard of English in Scotland. And I genuinely believe that. But because it's a second language, trying to make these kind of complex relationships between words is very, very difficult. So even if nobody has this, like an actual linguistic processing disorder, it's still something that is very, very difficult for some people to do just because they're not working in their first language. Dixit is a game of looking at weird, surreal, abstract cards. Saying a phrase or a word or making a noise or something that you think reflects that card, and then everybody else playing a card from their hand that they think best reflects your clue. And then somebody has to guess who was responsible for each of the different cards. And it's a game that if you are not able to make complex social deduction in the real term, as in, what do your friends associate with particular colors? What do they associate with particular shapes? There's one card, for example, that's a mouse with a sword going through a door in a labyrinth. What do your friends make of that? And if you're not able to get that kind of emotional read on your friends, Dixit is an incredibly frustrating game. But, you know, otherwise, I can't remember who it was, but somebody once said that Dixit sounded like a game that somebody would have designed in a Disney cartoon, because it is this really cute, whimsical, and surprisingly interesting thing. But it is also relying on some incredibly sophisticated emotional inference. Unlock is a very popular series of escape rooms in a box. And the thing that I think makes Unlock most interesting is that you have no idea in advance what the accessibility issues are going to be. Because if you did know what the accessibility issues were going to be, then you wouldn't have to solve anything, because you know what all the puzzles were likely to turn out to be. So basically, every time you open Unlock, it's a big, it's a loot box of accessibility problems, and you never know what they're going to be in advance. And then finally, the Arkham Horror, the card game, which is, again, a superb card game. But I have described its business model as being akin to a mugging, because it's a horror game where you have to buy scenario packs. And a lot of these kind of games are designed to be replayable, that you can sort of play again and again and again with the same decks and build up mastery. But that doesn't work in horror, because horror thrives in the world of the unexpected. So basically, Arkham Horror leads you maybe 3/10 of a way through a story, and then it says, well, go buy the other packs. And you buy the expansion, and it turns out it takes you only another 3 steps towards the end of the story, which is the point where I stopped playing it. But when it comes to this sort of required buying in to expansion, then the affordability of these kind of games becomes a serious question. You know, we're all aware, I'm sure, of when Magic the Gathering was at its peak, and people were, you know, kids were stealing money out of their parents' wallets and purses in order to buy more Magic cards, because they felt the need to continue to expand. But here, it's the narrative equivalent of the same kind of thing. I play a lot of these games for the stories they give me, and if I only get 6/10 of the story and I still have to buy another 4 expansion packs, I'm just not going to do that, because I don't think that business model is, it's tough to say it's unethical, but I think there are some significant problems in that kind of business model if you consider affordability to be an accessibility factor, which I do. So there is a reason why I spoke about all of those games, and the reason is this idea of the inaccessibility of fun is because games are all about putting barriers between someone and a goal. That's essentially what every single game is, a series of artificial obstacles that you have to overcome in order to achieve the thing that you want to achieve. And in games, what we tend to have are 2 different kinds of inaccessibilities. We have the intentional ones, which are the things that people have chosen to do because otherwise the game isn't the game. And then we have the unintentional inaccessibilities, which are the things that people didn't realize were problems with the game. So what we have in the inaccessibility of fun is this incredibly difficult puzzle of trying to make sure that the essence of a game remains what it should be, while still ensuring that the game is as accessible as possible. I gave a talk to the New York Times games people a while ago about how to make some of their games, well, their puzzles, more accessible, things like the crossword puzzle and spelling bee and such. And one of the things I spoke to them about was this idea of a dump stat, which is a role-playing game term, which is, you know, you've got strength, intelligence, dexterity, charisma. Which one of them doesn't give you any significant bonuses to your character? Well, lower that one down as much as you can so you can raise the other ones. The comment in the chat, always dump int. That was pretty much my life philosophy as well, yeah. So sometimes in these kind of things, the categories of accessibility, sometimes you have to consider, well, what's my dump stat there? Like if you are making a game like Scrabble, you are never going to make it accessible from a communication perspective, because it's all about how you can construct words and link words together. If you remove that, then you have removed the essence of Scrabble. So this puzzle, how do you make the game what you want it to be, while also including only those inaccessibilities that have to be there, is the, I think, defining challenge in the accessibility work that needs to be done in this hobby. But one of the things I like to do here is sort of give an example of this, because it's often when people hear that inaccessibility is where fun comes from, people often push back against that because it sounds like a ludicrous idea. But I often like to use the example of football, which is ridiculous because I don't actually really know how football is played. So anytime I try and explain what the artificiality of football, then I just end up showing this is a bad example, which is odd because it's the example I'm still going to use here. If you think of football as a game of trying to kick a ball into a goal, then if that goal is right in front of you, then there is no challenge. You know, apply any amount of pressure to the ball and it's going to go past the goal line. So that's not how we do football. We put the goal quite far away, and then you have to get the ball from there and then kick it into the goal. But that's not fun either, because once you get the ball to the point where it's supposed to be, there's still no challenge. So what you do is you put a goalkeeper in the way, somebody whose job is to stop you from being able to get that ball into the goal. But that's not fun, because generally speaking, the goalkeeper has the hardest job in football, in that they have to guess where the ball is going to go, and they're basically a last-ditch defense. So what you do is instead you put 11 other people whose job is to stop you getting that ball into the goal. But that's not fun, because then you can't do anything. So you get another 10 people on your side. And so as you add in these artificial barriers that stop you being able to get this ball into the goal, the fun of the game starts to emerge. And that's the really incredibly challenging thing that you have to balance there. What I like to try and encourage people to do is to think about how all of their inaccessibilities in a game are there by choice, that they can justify that there's a reason why that has to be there. And if there's no justification, then it's a good argument that, well, let's engineer that accessibility issue out of the game. But it is undoubtedly an incredibly difficult challenge for people to address. And so one of the things that I thought was really, really nice from this event was looking over the roster of talks and discussions that were going to be going on and finding out all the different ways in which people were addressing accessibility, because I honestly think that all of the work that's being done here falls into an accessibility, the accessibility category. And to a certain extent, that might just be, once you've got a hammer, every problem looks like a nail kind of thing. So anytime I see something, it's an accessibility issue. But look at some of the stuff that people are going to be talking about later on today. There are issues of, for example, themes. And themes in gaming are a big issue, because accessibility doesn't just exist in the games. It also exists in the people that play the games. And we have various accessibility challenges in how we talk about games as a community. Like, for example, video games have this, maybe not so much nowadays, but certainly when I was a bit younger, not even hugely younger, but a bit younger, there was this idea of girls' games and boys' games. That The Sims was a girls' game. And I think that's nonsense, because I've played the hell of every single version of The Sims that's ever been there. Call of Duty is a boys' game. And it's nonsense, but it is the way in which some people do talk about the themes in particular kinds of games. And one of the reasons why I mentioned Fog of Love earlier is because Fog of Love is an example of a game that is addressing a thematic issue in gaming. It's not a game about trading silks in the Mediterranean like so many board games are. It's a game about how do you navigate the complexity of a romantic relationship. And that's a brave, incredibly interesting theme to address, particularly because what we've seen in the market is that the market doesn't really reward people taking those kind of thematic risks. One of the games that I think is most interesting, although one that I personally find very difficult to play, is a game called Holding On by Hub Games. And basically that is a game about palliative care. There is an old man who's come into a hospital, nobody knows who he is, and you play the medical staff who are trying to keep him alive while also trying to get some sense of who he is and who they can contact to tell them that, this old man is basically seeing out his last days of life. And I found that, as I say, a difficult game to play, because it brought up a number of memories about when my father died. but the fact that that game exists and the fact that it has this very brave theme is one of the ways in which we can address the accessibility of theme inside board games. And as I say, unfortunately, it didn't sell hugely well, perhaps because all of the reviews were, I found this a difficult game to play, but it's a very worthy game. But, you know, taking those kind of risks with theme is important. I already mentioned the idea of representation being a way for people to see themselves reflected in the games that they are expected to play. And if you see a sea of white men on the boards, the board game covers, you think this is a game for white men. So, but representation also happens at a range of different levels. Like, for example, it's not enough to say, well, we have a 50-50 split between men and women. For various reasons, that's not appropriate in this day and age. But even if it's just in the case of looking at that as a sex binary, it's also about how you represent people in the game. Like, for example, the Conan board game has a number of women represented, but they're all half naked or princesses that you pick up and you know, that you treat them as objects inside the game. And that's not okay. So the representation has to be more than just this sort of shallow idea of that it should be a case of having, you know, a gender mix in the game. It's also important about who has the power in those kind of games. You know, if all the male characters have the strongest representations, like they're always leaders or they're always in charge of things, then, and all the women are housewives and, you know, cleaners and those kind of things, you're still dealing with the same problem, even if technically speaking, you've checked a mark to say we have diversity here. But there's also a deeper issue in terms of just how we think about what has value in games. There is a term that I really don't like in video games, and it's called walking simulator. And it's this idea that games like Dear Esther or What Remains of Edith Finch, or to a lesser extent, things like the Stanley Parable, are just games about walking around. And people mean that, you know, these are not games. These are games that people, you know, they're like art experiences kind of thing. But what I've tried to redefine them as is a kind of empathic puzzler, in that you're not trying to solve a logical deduction. You're not trying to do something, you know, that is a case of stressing your tactical or your strategic thinking, all the things that are very highly valued in a lot of board game rule sets. It's about understanding a situation or a circumstance and being able to build some empathy for the characters, even if they're not actually physically represented in the game. Gone Home, for example, I found to be an incredibly touching game because it was about understanding the circumstances of a younger woman coming to terms with their sexuality. And that's a circumstance, obviously, I don't have a lot of direct experience with. So the puzzle of the game, the skill set required to understand and get the most out of Gone Home is one that's about emotional literacy rather than strategic or tactical thinking. And I don't think in the marketplace, and I don't think in the communities and the conversations we have about board games and video games and all kinds of games that we stress that enough. So it's great to see that these kind of things are all being addressed as part of the structure of the talks. So to finalize, for me, people sometimes look at this work and they say, oh, aren't you a nice guy looking at all this kind of stuff, trying to make games more accessible for people? Aren't you a good man? And the answer is no, I'm not, because this is basically threaded through with self-interest. For one thing, I just think it's an amazingly interesting area. But the other thing is, I don't have time to play all of the games I want to play. When I retire, when I say when I retire, if any of us get to retire, I want to be able to play the games that I didn't have time to play now. And the solution to doing that is to make games accessible right now. Because if we don't make games accessible now, by the time that we are older, the games that are released are not going to be accessible to us. So we are all only temporarily able to participate in any of this kind of stuff. You know, there is this sort of idea that everybody is only temporarily abled because we're just a car crash or a few years away from having essentially the accessibility issues that we see from other people. But it's also the case, we're all only temporarily able to engage in a luxury hobby. The cost of living crisis shows how precarious our free spending money actually is. we are all only temporarily the default audience for any particular kind of game in any particular kind of category. So part of what I use to sell this idea of accessibility is what I refer to as the grid of enlightened self-interest. And it's based on this basic principle here. This is something my PhD supervisor said to me, and it blew me away. It is something that was just absolutely nailed for me what the core of this kind of work is. And it is that extraordinary people, as in people with disabilities, in ordinary everyday circumstances, have many of the same needs as ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. As a simple example of that, the accessibility issues for someone with Parkinson's trying to write a text message is the same as the accessibility issue of me trying to write a text message on a rickety bus that just keeps juddering from side to side. It's not the same circumstance, but the solutions and the requirements are very much the same. So when I often talk about this, and this is the last thing I will say before we can move on to the other things, is that there is a way you can view accessibility through essentially two axes of categorization. One is the specific kinds of accessibility issues that people often have. So, you know, color blindness, visual accessibilities, physical, and also the ones that I referred to earlier in terms of socioeconomics and emotional accessibility. But also in terms of the severity of what we're talking about. So when people think of accessibility, it's often the case they think of permanent inaccessibility. You know, someone is blind or they're not. Someone has dementia or they don't. But there are also two subtler categories. One is temporary, and we all have temporary accessibility issues as we go along. You know, these are conditions that are not permanent, but they will last for a non-trivial period of time. So if you break an arm, for example, you have all of the same accessibility issues as someone who has had a limb amputated. It's just that eventually that's going to change. But there's also an even subtler category, which are situational effects, which are things that will flick in and out of being relevant as you go through your day. So for example, if you're carrying a baby, you can put that baby down, you can pick that baby up, you can, you know, slip in and out of this category of being physically inaccessible. But it's still the case that all of the things that affect the other two categories affect you. Color blindness is an issue of lighting as much as it is an issue of, you know, cones and receptors in your eyes. So when you actually have, for example, bad lighting in a room, that can actually create the same issues of color blindness, and the solutions are exactly the same. So I'm not going to go over this grid in any great detail because it's basically just providing some examples of how all these different categories can manifest in all these different kinds of degrees of permanence. But I think it's something that's worth having a look at, because I found this, if you're trying to sell accessibility in your organization, I found this to be a good way of explaining to people, it's not just about an audience of people with disabilities who may or may not be available if you make accessible games. We all benefit from accessibility. It's what's sometimes called the curb cut effect. You know, when something is done for the benefit of people who have disabilities, we all benefit. So, final point then. I think it's great from looking at the roster of talks in multi-platform. I think it's great to see how many people are looking at so many different issues that I consider to be accessibility areas, and coming up with so many different ways of actually dealing with it. So I would like to say thank you to everybody for all the talks you're going to put forward. I think they all sound tremendously interesting, and thank you all for fighting the good fight on the topic of accessibility.
Thank you, Michael. That was fantastically interesting and really informative. I've been watching the chat throughout your talk, and we've got quite a few questions have already come up. So I think we'll probably, if we start at the top of those, and if we read them out to you, if you particularly want to voice your own question, put your hand up. But we'll start with those in the chat. Can you? What was our first one?
So we've got a question from Beatrix who says, how do you balance the definition of accessibility that you're using in regards to approachability? how would you personally differentiate accessibility and approachability in this regard? So she says, you know, you may have covered that to some extent as you carried on talking, but she sees there's a distinction between something being approachable and accessible.
Yeah, and I agree entirely. And it is one of the big definitional issues in this particular area, because people often do use this word accessibility to refer to approachability. And it means that when you have these conversations, it's really difficult to find this common ground. Like, for example, the conversation that occurred a few years ago about difficulty levels in video games, particularly in relation to Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. And people were talking about, like, for example, easy difficulty is an accessibility issue. And that's true, but that's not the sense in which people were actually talking about it. What they meant was, if you want people to play Souls-likes, you need to have an easy pathway into people playing Souls-likes. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that, but I do acknowledge that there is a definitional problem for people who are coming from accessibility as a field. People are talking about gaming as a field and what accessibility actually means.
When you were talking, actually, Michael, I was thinking about things to do with taste and surprise, and so as a LARP designer, and there's some other LARP designers in the audience too, and we're thinking about accessibility when we're trying to advertise our games, who would like to play them, who's able to play them. Obviously there's all sorts of kind of barriers to participation. If I say my game is going to have these themes, you might not like them, you might not want to play, but that's very different to what you were saying. If you start playing an unlock game and a theme appears halfway through the game that you weren't expecting. So that, I think maybe there's something there between approachability and accessibility, if it's a real unexpected thing rather than just I don't know if that. I
think because there is a game called Time Stories, which is kind of the same kind of thing. But one of the first installments in that starts off in an insane asylum. And you think to yourself, well, this is going to be a tasteful look at the topic of mental health. But no, it's full of like little girl cannibals and, horrible, dehumanizing approaches to treating these kind of illnesses. But the box of Time Stories is, it is a beautifully designed box. It is just a very minimalistic thing with just a picture, and you think, oh, this is going to be exciting. But then bang, this theme does explode into your face. And that is a problem. Because certainly in, like, for example, if you play a Lovecraft game, there's going to be some ridiculous sanity meter in there, which it's just part of the vocabulary of a Lovecraft game. Treating it that, I don't think games in general do very well at all. I can't think of many of them. But yeah, this surprise factor is a factor of a number of games because they can't tell you in advance what's going to be there.
That's great, thanks. So the next question in the chat that came up is from Joe, who asks, do you feel that cooperative games are innately more accessible as they can harness the strengths of the players rather than disadvantage those with accessibility challenges?
Yeah, and absolutely. I do think cooperative games are a really good solution to accessibility issues. And it's interesting because this is a thing that people talk about as being a problem in games, which is this concept of what's called quarterbacking, which is somebody who knows the game telling other people what they should do for maximum success on their turn. And yeah, that's very frustrating if you know the game and somebody is forcing their opinion into how it should be played. But it's also a tremendous accessibility aid, if you can give people hints to what's going on. So it just goes to show that there is the tension between making a game accessible intentionally and unintentionally inaccessible. There's a flip side to that. There is unintentional accessibility, and that happens, I would say, more often than the intentional accessibility.
Yeah, and we have a question from Michael, who's a gaming lab representative who's in the audience today, and a researcher who's concerned with these issues and a member of the Asmodee research too. So he's asking you how the industry is evolving on these subjects in your opinion. Is there any progress, even if there's not enough progress?
Okay, so Asmodee in particular have recently released an imprint called Access Plus, which I think, as far as the press went, they reported it very poorly, and that they talked about this being, Asmodee's push for accessibility, and it's really about healthcare intervention. And I had a conversation with the people there yesterday. So basically, when I spoke to them about, like, for example, Asmodee is the biggest name in board games. If anybody was going to push the dial on accessibility, it would be Asmodee. So if there is any opportunity to feed in there, I would love to do it. But there are some companies who, like, for example, Stonemaier Games have an accessibility consultant. You know, there is somebody that they put all their games past. And when I've looked at their games, certainly the Scythe and Wingspan and such, there are obvious accessibility flourishes in there that were obviously very intentional, and that's great. And there are a number of companies who do take accessibility seriously. Like, for example, the Pandemonium Institute, who did Blood on the Clock Tower. Long before I got in touch with them, they were already talking about how they make the game more accessible and putting out blog posts and things for it. So there is some progress. And 6 years ago, when nobody was talking about this, except for me and a handful of people and a handful of posts, and now there is kind of a community around accessibility in board games. There's people who are looking at color blindness. There's people who are looking at, you know, visual impairment. And, you know, if you are interested in finding out some of those names, I can provide them to Paul and he can send them out to you. So things are getting better, but not really at the speed I would hope. But I think Asmodee does have an opportunity here to massively move the dial on accessibility without it even realistically being much of a cost. So maybe we should talk.
Thank you. So, right, the next question we've got is from Rob Gallagher, who asks about the role of house rules. I mean, allowing players and groups to negotiate accessibility of particular games. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that.
So house rules, I mean, board games are infinitely moddable. You know, you can do whatever you like with them, and that's one of the great strengths that they have. But this is also a community aspect. Like, for example, if you play chess and you make a move and you take your fingers off the piece, the culture of chess is that that move can't be taken back. And you can house rule that. But if you play with somebody who believes in, you know, raw rules as written, or, you know, even, you know, I don't know if that's a written rule in chess. I don't know if chess has a manual. But if you believe in rules as written, as a lot of people do, a lot of people are strict in terms of the interpretation of the rules. So my favorite thing that rule books can do is that they can give permission for certain kinds of cognitively accessible things. My favorite example is, I think this is probably in Mage Knight, but I saw it in Star Trek Frontiers, but they're basically the same game with a different skin. But it explicitly says in the rule book, you can take back any part of your move or all of your move until the game state changes. And what that means is that rather than it being a case of you making a mistake and then having to live with that mistake, the rules have explicitly enabled you to have that cognitively accessible variant that might be in a house rule. And yeah, I mean, I think house rules are fantastic as accessibility aids, but the problem with the wider community is, as I say, they often believe in rules as written. And you can't really judge that because a game is a systemic thing. You know, you change the rules and you change the game. But I absolutely think house rules are a superb tool that people have available.
Perfect. And we've got another question, actually, Francis, sorry, I scrolled too far to see who it's come from. It's from Michael again. So on the topic of rules, a question about how might rule learning itself become more accessible?
Yeah, so I've written a post about this on the topic of the universal inaccessibility, and it's basically rule books, because rule books are a barrier that exists in board games that does not exist in any other discipline to the same kind of extent. So like if you play Dungeons and Dragons, for example, your dungeon master will be telling you how you're supposed to execute the rules. But in board games, everybody works as part of a cardboard computer. You know, everybody is responsible for correctly processing game state, evaluating it and making sensible moves, because otherwise nobody at the table has any fun. And that's an amazingly stressful thing when you consider that our default way of learning things is still a rule book. Videos, like learn to play videos, are fine, but unfortunately I tend to find them even more inaccessible. As in, if I look at a video that is 45 minutes long to explain to me how a 20-minute game works, I'm not going to watch that video. And what I've found is a lot of people feel the same. And videos are, for example, difficult to index, you know, swapping back and forwards through videos to find out particular things that have been covered is a difficulty. The best approach I've seen is how Fantasy Flight does it, which is they have their learn to play manual and then they have their reference manual. And that sort of recognizes the key issue that we have in how we write game rule books, which is they are instructional, but they also have to be a reference work. And those two things are have to be structured completely differently. So what Fantasy Flight have done is basically just said, well, let's do both, because we can't find a way to do one of them. But yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to the question of how do we make the learning of rules simpler, because it just seems to be something that is an almost insurmountable barrier. But I would also suggest, again, talking about Fog of Love. Fog of Love has a very interesting sort of video game style tutorial where you sort of seed particular cards into the deck and they tell you how to interpret the rules. That is something that maybe can be examined more in terms of, is this the way in which games have to move forward? But in itself, it's not a perfect solution, because you still need, you know, anytime you teach it to a new person, you still need to set up the decks in the right kind of way. You know, there's no matter how far down you go, there are some rules that somebody has to learn.
Thank you. Well, that's one last question. I think there might be a few more in the chat, but we'll have to, for time's sake, just have one last question. And it's from Laura, who is asking about rule hacking as, I guess, a counter question to rule learning, and a kind of idea that we can maybe perhaps more widely share rule hacking. Is that, you know, what do you feel about rule hacking? How can we maybe bring that into play cultures?
Yeah, I mean, the issue with sort of as a wider kind of rule hacking is, you know, Monopoly is the perfect example. Now, if you open a new copy of Monopoly, and I know that's not the kind of game we're really talking about here, but if you open a new copy of Monopoly, before you see anything else, you see a sheet of paper, and what it says is, you do not put your fine money on free parking. You do not get double money if you land on go. It gives you all of these sort of house rules that people adopt over the years and says, these are not the rules of Monopoly, because they believe this is the reason people don't have fun with Monopoly. And, you know, so the problem with these kind of sort of hacked versions of the game, because one of the things you often find in board games is that, coming back to this issue of the rule book, we all learn sort of folk versions of board games. There's one person who reads it, and then they're the person who teaches the group. And they don't necessarily get it right. I mean, for people like us, I always play a game 3 times. First time, I play it incorrectly. Second time, I play it correctly for the first time. And third time, you know, you get the actual proper feel of like repeated plays. But these kind of folk games that we play are what we sort of understand the game to be, rather than what the rules of the game are. And when you sort of get into this idea of Monopoly as a folk game, because I don't know, maybe we can even have like a show of hands in the chat. How many of you have read the rules for Monopoly? You know, it is the default game of the hobby, or of an older version of the hobby. And how many people have read the rules? And how many people got taught by an older brother or an older sister or whatever? So yeah, the rules hacking, the issue with that tends to be that unless they are play tested in the same kind of detail and, you know, diligence that most games get, there's always the risk that they ruin the game. But I think there's maybe a very good market there for accessibility hacks in board games. And you can see a number of people who have, like, it's not an area I feel comfortable in doing anything with, but there are a number of people who will explain, like, for example, this colorblind inaccessible game, what I did was I tied little cords around these meeples so I could tell which ones were which. You know, people do have these kind of solutions, you know, spray painting your pieces and such. So they do exist out there, but I think if we were able to sort of bring those together into some kind of resource, that could be a really useful community way for people to address inaccessibility in games that don't have somebody pushing for accessibility in the background.
Thank you.